Listo.
Muy buenas tardes, muchas gracias por su presencia en esta conferencia que, bueno, nos hace reflexionar acerca de la importancia, el poder de la información, el poder de los datos. Pues no me dejarán mentir, es algo que mueve al mundo actualmente. Y bueno, pues tenemos una invitada especial. Ella es Sarah Williams, profesora asociada de Tecnología y Planificación Urbana del Instituto de Tecnología de Massachusetts, el MIT, donde también es directora del Laboratorio de Diseño de Datos Cívicos y del Centro Leventhal de Urbanismo Avanzado. Williams combina su formación en computación y diseño para crear estrategias de comunicación que exponen los problemas de política urbana a un público amplio y generan un cambio cívico. Ella llama al proceso Data Action, que también es el nombre de su reciente libro publicado por MIT Press. Sara es cofundadora y desarrolladora de Envelope City, un producto de software basado en la web que visualiza y permite a los usuarios modificar la zonificación en la ciudad de Nueva York. Antes de llegar al MIT, Sarah Williams fue codirectora del Laboratorio de Diseño de Información Espacial en la Escuela de Graduados de Planificación y Preservación de Arquitectura de la Universidad de Columbia. Su trabajo de diseño ha sido ampliamente exhibido, incluido el trabajo en el Guggenheim, en el Museo de Arte Moderno, la Bienal de Venecia y el Museo Cooper Hewitt. Williams ha ganado numerosos premios, incluido el haber sido nombrada una de las 25 mejores planificadoras de tecnología y Game Changer por la revista Metrópolis. Su más reciente exposición se titula Visualizing de Nueva York, en New York City 2021 en el Centro de Arquitectura de la Ciudad de Nueva York. Bueno, pues es un historial bastante importante, muy interesante, es un perfil muy adecuado para la maestría de Comunicación, Información y Diseño y bueno, no se diga en este contexto del poder de los datos. Pues adelante, Sara, bienvenida.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I wish I could introduce myself as well in Spanish, but I cannot. So hopefully you can all bear with my English lecture today. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, let's just see. Is it showing my slides or is it showing the notes?
The notes, actually.
The notes, okay, let's try again. Okay, how about now?
Yep, just a slide.
Perfect, okay, great. I first want to start by thanking you for inviting me to give a lecture with you all today. It's always great to be able to share my work with others, so I'm very excited to be here. As was mentioned, I'm an associate professor of technology and urban planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I run the Civic Data Design Lab and the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. The Leventhal Center is a cross-disciplinary center which combines the research of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and systems thinking, not about the problems of yesterday, but of tomorrow. And we were motivated by radical changes in our environment and the role that design and research can play in these. I myself am very interdisciplinary. I combined training as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I apply this work to the lab. And I really build interdisciplinary teams for all the projects that I work on in my research center. So here's an example of a team where we have a computer scientist, an urban planner, a computation media artist, architect. And I really think it's the diversity of skills here that really allow us to take data to action. So what do I mean by this? I'm going to use an example of a project which has now close to 15 years of impact, a project which I did with the team, Laura Kurgan, Eric Kadora, David Reinford, and myself, a data scientist and a designer. And in this project, we took data from the criminal justice system of where people lived before they went to prison. We added it up block by block, and those red blocks show where it costs over $1 million to incarcerate people from that block. When you zoom in, you find whole communities such as this one, where $17 million is spent to incarcerate people. How could this money be spent to alleviate the systematic reasons for mass incarceration? The maps expose our response to poverty is incarceration rather than prevention. Imagine if we just spent some of this money on educational services. The maps were first seen at the Center for Architecture in New York, where we, along with other cities, not just New York, but we did New Orleans, Phoenix, and 10 other cities. And we asked policy experts, criminal justice advocates, people from the community, urban planners, if they had 1 million of that dollars, what would they use it for in the community to help address some of these systematic problems? The maps were seen by a congressman, by the Museum of Modern Art, and they were included in an exhibit there called The Design of the Elastic Mind. And these maps were seen by a congressman in that exhibition who asked if we could use these maps for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010, which allocated $25 million to reentry programming. And if we look back at that $17 million map, we know that's not enough, but it's certainly better than nothing. This work led me to really think about my process, and is a great example of data action methodology, because communicating with data in this way requires the ability to ask the right questions by building expert teams, finding or collecting the appropriate data, analyzing and interpreting the results, and visualizing those results in a way that can be understood by broad audiences. Combining these methods transforms data from a simple point on a map to a narrative that has meaning. Data is not often processed in this way because data analysts are often not familiar with the techniques that can be used to tell stories with data ethically and responsibly. Data action seeks to provide that guidance. So this brings me to the premise of our talk today, my new book, Data Action, Using Data for a Public Good. The premise for my book really started with the reality that in the last decade, we have created an unprecedented amount of data, which is only set to increase by 10-fold, largely developed by private companies, such as this data set from Google's autonomous vehicles. While not all of this data is closed, like the previous example, all of the excitement from civic hackers to consulting groups such as McKinsey left me with a pain on my side. Did these groups know the ways in which data intentionally or unintentionally can cause harm? Did they know how, in their excitement to do good, they might be marginalizing or even forgetting whole populations? And while criticism began to mount from academics about the potential misuse of data, as you see in the examples above, and rightfully so, I found we needed a way to show people how to use data ethically and responsibly. I found we needed to explain to these data enthusiasts and my students alike the ways in which we could use data for the purposes of empowerment rather than oppression, an attempt to do no harm. So I decided to develop data action, which I believe presents a corrective standard to data practices by acknowledging, corrective standard to data action by acknowledging that data represents the ideologies of those who control its use. Data action at its heart was developed by data enthusiasts and novices, civic hackers, urban planners, and policy experts to provide guidance for using data ethically and responsibly. Data action asks advocates of big data analytics to rethink how they work with data to make the process more responsive to the people their work affects. So in the first chapter of data action, data for cities is not new. I position the reader within this larger narrative by providing a historical account of the ways those in power have used data to shape our cities, how they have reinforced structural racism, and how data has helped enforce the marginalization of various populations. At the same time, I illustrate the many benefits that analyzing data has provided to society, such as establishing social services and stopping the spread of disease. The juxtaposition of these two outcomes provides a reminder that the person analyzing the data defines its use. So we consider gerrymandering in this chapter, and I bring up the case of Thomas Hofstadter, who pushed around data to create Republican districts in the United States. A self-proclaimed data nerd, he started his work since the first digital census came out in the 1970s and systematically used it to push around congressional districts towards Republican favor. A recent discovery of personal notes from his computer confirmed how he was using districts to try to really push and the goal to having more neighborhoods that would vote for Trump. And in fact, there have been such scandals from his notes from a computer. It's even been discussed that he was the one who tried to ask the citizenship question on the census, which really resulted in a lot of undercounting in this most recent census that we did. Chapter 2, build it. Data is never raw, it's collected. It's surprising, given all the hype swirling around massive amounts of data in today's world, that some essential data is still missing. This miss usually represents the interests and needs of those on the margins of society, but it also often represents topics that governments and companies seek to keep hidden. Chapter 2, Build It, challenges us, communities, and data specialists alike to create the data needed to encourage policy action. The examples in Build It show that today anyone can go about collecting data with very little training. This is because innovations in technology make it easier than ever to collect personal data. From our mobile devices to environmental sensors in our home, modern life is full of tools to measure aspects of our lives. It's up to us to understand the data we need and how to use those technologies to develop narratives that can make an impact on policy. In this chapter, I use an example of a project that I worked on during the Beijing Olympics, combined with the Associated Press, where we developed air quality sensors to expose the air quality conditions in China. You can see here, this red graph or this red bar chart shows the air quality and particularly the particulate matter air quality in Beijing right before the Olympics and during. And you can see that it's well above the World Health Standards for developing countries. You'll notice that it got better towards the end of the Olympics, and that was because it was raining those days. Those are the days that you can bring particulate matter out of the air. The data in association with the Associated Press was visualized on their website and was given to any organization that was using the AP reporting as their tool for presenting coverage. So everyone from CNN to CNBC was using the Associated Press reporting and was the only reported air quality during the Olympics. The data also was exhibited in the New York Times. Here, what we actually see is that the Olympics reduced half of the cars along the roadway in Beijing, and that reduction did improve CO during the Olympics. And although data collection is important, this chapter explains how building data together strengthens communities around their shared interests. Building sensors, learning about data measurements, and collaborating with one another creates the bonds necessary to generate change. Build It inspires us to create our own community data collection project, not only because they can literally change our community, but also because they can create new communities, such as this one that was created around the oil spill in the Gulf, and really brought together just diverse and very different community groups around mapping out where the oil spill was. And through this project, they were able to create a broader team to really help get the government to create change and really identify the problem going on during that large Gulf oil spill. And while Build It describes how to collect missing data and use it to fill gaps in knowledge, Hack It shows that oftentimes data already exists openly, although we might not see it that way because it's stored and manipulated by private companies. In some countries where data is tightly controlled by the government who produces it, privately owned data is the only data that exists openly for analyzing the dynamics of our lives. This third chapter argues that we ought to be creative in the ways we obtain data to answer important questions about society, nonetheless acknowledging that data acquired for one purpose and applied towards another holds numerous ethical concerns that must be considered. Data action provides guidance for those who seek to use it. And so in this chapter, I use an example that looks at ghost cities in China. And if you're not familiar with ghost cities, they're really residential and large cities that lie largely vacant. And knowing where these are can help identify risk in the Chinese real estate market. But data about vacant developments are not available through the government. And so we set out to test and figure out ways in which we could try to model where these ghost cities are to identify those risks. And one of the things we thought was a thriving community needs restaurants, schools, grocery stores, places to eat. And could we use data on amenities to identify those places that lacked amenities? We scraped data from the Chinese version of Yelp called Dianping. And this is a map of showing those amenities in Chengdu. Once we had the amenity data, we scraped residential locations from a map and Baidu and overlay a grid of 300 by 300 meters. And then we measured from the center of that grid all of the amenities. And so you can see here not only did we measure the distance from the residential locations, but we actually looked at the reviews to see if they were places that people actually went to. We applied Hansen's gravitational model that measures urban accessibility to create an amenity score for each residential location. Hansen's gravitational model accounts for the fact that we would travel further if we lived in a suburb to an amenity. We removed some cells with amenity score above the mean, and then we performed spatial autocorrelation on those remaining cells. The idea is if they cluster, they're most likely to be a ghost city. One of the things that I talk about as being really important in data action is ground truthing. And we went to Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an to find out how well our model performed. In Xi'an, we found many locations that looked like this. They were developed probably 4 or 5 years ago. And the Chinese government would argue that eventually these locations will be occupied, but they just haven't been occupied yet. And that there's greater benefit in the economics of building these developments and the jobs that they create, even though they might lie vacant for 5 to 10 years. We also found areas like this, stalled development next to semi-occupied housing. And in case these houses were occupied by people who lived on the land before these developments were created. So these were villagers that were living here and they were given apartments in these buildings. I should also note that some of these ghost cities, even though they lie mostly vacant, have been sold. And that's because there is a common practice in China to invest money in real estate that you would never move to. Before the Chinese stock market existed, this was a great way to invest your money. We also found things like this. This is former communist housing, being readied for redevelopment. And then we found whole cities, just like this one outside Xi'an, that have been built but never completed. This was meant to be the science center. And so what we did is after we made this model, we did this in 10 cities across China. We created this data visualization that allowed users to explore and understand the model behind our data. Here you see it clicking on a cell and you can see that the distance between different amenities that cause that particular cell to have a high amenity score. And what we're trying to do here is really to make the model a bit more transparent, but also allow us to show the information to people on the ground to ask them whether what we found really rang true. So one of the things that we were really grateful for and is part of the data action model is that really we had a lot more candid conversations with urban planners who talked about the controversial aspects of these vacant developments. And many local planners say that they know that these developments shouldn't have been made, but those decisions were made based on theory without data. So kind of talking about knowing that, if you open up a piece of land where there's no schools, no banks, of course, people are not going to move there. We talked to real estate developers who said the burst of the real estate bubble will carry irreversible impacts on residents who buy homes with mortgages. And one of the things that he told us is this practice of opening up land by the government for development is common because many times the real estate developers haven't been able to pay back loans for previous developments. So since the bank and the government are the same, they have an interest in giving them a loan for a new piece of land that they can then use to pay back for their previous loan. And it's become a bit of a Ponzi scheme. The mismatch between supply and demand geospatially is a big problem, says the real estate professor at Tsinghua. The oversupply is really looming ahead. And we believe we've created a map that shows risk in the real estate market before it's been developed, and can be a guide for a potential foreclosure crisis before it happens. But as I said, most projects in the lab really try to translate our work into a public display and communicate it to broader groups of people. And this is the exhibition in Seoul biannual, where we connected our maps to drone footage that we created when we did our ground truthing of the site, and was seen by thousands of people. So chapter 4, share it, communicating data insights. While Hackett asks us to innovatively find, acquire, and analyze data for policy change by communicating the results of those analytics ingeniously. Chapter 4, share it, stresses the importance of sharing the data both in its raw form and also through visualizations. Sharing data helps the public have access to information, acquire knowledge, and ultimately make better civic decisions. Sharing data through visualizations can communicate the insights of data without asking everyone to be data scientists. In this project, I take you to Nairobi. And in Nairobi, matatus, or the buses you see here, are the main form of transit for 3.5 million people. Yet when I started working in Nairobi, there was not information about where these buses went, not even a map. This data is essential for planning and creating transportation models, but also can be leveraged to develop applications that can help decrease congestion that plague the city, as exhibited here. While matatus are essential to the operation of the city, the government had no data about where they go, but they represent the majority of vehicles on the roadway. So thinking about my previous work in Nairobi, I used machine learning to apply remotely sensed images to create the first data set of roads in Nairobi, taking satellite imagery and interpreting the results. And I had created also the first land use map showing density in the same way. And I thought, could I apply data science to capture data about the matatu system, which 3.5 million people depend on every day. And when I went out to look for a map on this, all I heard was, you just ask your local matatu driver. And I thought, could I generate data on the matatu system, which I could use for my transportation models and modeling work in Nairobi, but also present that data for everyone to use? Shouldn't we all have a map of where our bus system goes? So I thought, how could I leverage the ubiquitous nature of cell phone use in Nairobi, Kenya, to capture data about the informal transit system, which most citizens depend upon, and open that data up for anyone to use and build upon? Our research team collaborated with the University Nairobi Computer Science Department to develop an application that collected data on routes and stops. Our collaboration with the university was important because we wanted the local knowledge on how the applications are used to remain in Nairobi. But more importantly, we wanted the knowledge of how to build these systems to stay here. The collaboration of these skills allowed a transfer of knowledge between both cultures. The data was collected in GTFS, which is a simple format that holds latitude and longitude data, which draws a network of the Matatu system of volunteers collect the data on buses. And I should just stop and note to say that GTFS is the same standard format that's used by Google when you map yourself or route yourself on transit. So I imagine many of you have used Google Maps to navigate on the transit system. So developing a visualization that would allow the public to understand the complexity of the system became a challenge as we began to play with the data to determine ways to visualize it. And you can see the many overlapping maps and quarters here. And we decided to split up and color the different quarters along the Nairobi. And as we did this, we really thought about creating a data visualization that looks very similar to what you might see in London, Paris, even Mexico City, and stylize the map in that same way. The map was edited by the Matatu drivers, owners, and the government. And the collaboration here, and I'm just gonna let you guys view this. I'll just put this on pause. What's happening here actually is that many of the Matatu drivers are realizing there are not a lot of informal transit or Matatus in the northern section, and they're instantly using this map as a planning tool. We held workshops also with government officials and transit stakeholders to get a sense of whether they would be able to read the map. Here we're working again with Matatu drivers and Uber drivers to make edits to several versions of the map. Ultimately, the map went viral on the internet and social media, and newspapers published them as inserts so those without phones could use and access the maps. What I like to talk about with this project is that measuring success in an open data project is really when others leverage the data we created to generate their own policy change. So while we were able to use this data to create a transportation model in Nairobi to help reduce traffic congestion, we were also really excited when the Nairobi government, who was largely disinterested in the project, asked us to come to a press conference where they gave the map to the governor of Nairobi County and made it the official map of the city. And so while we kept them informed about the process all along the way, it was really, they felt that they co-owned this map with us, and that's exactly how we wanted it. So while they weren't super participatory while we were developing it, they trusted the data and they trusted the methodology enough so to make it the official map of the city. It was the first informal transit system navigable on Google Maps. So if you go to Nairobi, you can pick the public transport option to find your way around the city. And now many other cities have followed. I like to show this map because Nairobi is trying to make a bus rapid transit system. This is a system where buses have dedicated lanes. And you might not notice, but this is not our map. This is a map of the bus transit system. But what the the city was trying to do here is leverage the popularity of our map to help get approval for this new system. We worked very closly with the technology community in Nairobi, and we held a hackathon. And from that hackathon, there are now 5 mobile applications that use our data as their base, including a Waze-like app that allows us to talk about traffic congestion. Semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world, not just in Nairobi, but the majority of cities outside the US and Europe use these systems, and many of these cities have followed our lead. You see maps in Amman and Managua, and in fact, 36 cities are now part of a global network of mapping transit data. And we have a resource center in Latin America and Africa currently. Chapter 5, data as a public good. I believe it's important to think of data as a public good, a non-rivalrous commodity that can be valued by all that consume it. A commodity similar to electricity, which needs regulation so that it can be used equitably by the public. Society should work with private companies to find ways for them to share their data ethically and responsibly so that we can use data towards the betterment of society. And in this chapter, I talk a bit about the fact that Africa is a continent of missing data, where fewer than half the births are recorded by some countries, and many have not taken census for years. This data is crucial in locating them and formulating policy. And the World Bank says that it can lead to a denial of basic rights. This has become such a big issue that the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals make data important to all aspects of data is important to all aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals and included in all of the initiatives. And while I talk about the lack of data, what's quite ironic is that data exists in many of these countries in the hands of Google and Facebook. And in the 5th and final chapter, I remind us in this rapidly growing data landscape, there is a growing divide between the people who have access to data and those who do not. And while data was once something that only landowners and governments controlled, now private companies are accumulating exponential amounts of data every day, which gives them the same power once held solely by governments. Some believe this amounts to data colonialism, where private companies extract our data as a resource and use it as a tool of control. So in this chapter, I think about a project where we worked with Facebook, and we aggregated, and we took their aggregated data about cell phone use to create a map that looked at the lack of internet infrastructure in Nairobi. So taking things like download speeds, people who connection in general, we were able to create these maps where you see these red areas show the areas that need access to the internet. And through these maps, we can hope that the government can use it as a way and a guide to increase internet access. And through this project, we got very interested in internet access, and the value is not just in infrastructure development, but it's in social development for many of these communities. So we started a project just before COVID called Living Data Hubs with partners in Kenya to create and co-design a wireless network that's community owned and a data collection tool that's community built. So these wireless hubs that we installed in Kibera, one of Nairobi's largest informal settlements, now provides access to the internet, but it also has air quality sensors attached. These community business owners that have put these on their buildings within Cabrera sell that data in order to recover the costs of the sensors. And this allows them to own the data and control its use rather than an outside organization coming in. So the value here is really, I mean, it's not hard to explain, as we know all of us need internet during COVID. So I just want to, in the kind of final chapter of the book, I really talk about data action principles. And while each story I tell in the book explains this, I want to leave you and the reader with some final thoughts. First, the first principle is do no harm. We must interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. And so just an example of what I mean here is, you can imagine if I made maps of an informal transit system in a place where the government really wanted to crack down and remove these systems, I could be potentially creating a lot of harm by developing the map, because those informal transit systems many people depend upon. That's not the case in Nairobi, but in some cities that have asked us to make maps, we haven't done it because we know they would be used as a tool to remove the informal transit rather than protect it or elevate its use. And you can imagine lots of other ways that data could do harm in that way. The second principle is build teams. Building teams to create narratives around data for action is essential for communicating the results effectively. And I really believe, it's this combination of people and their networks, and really, working with policy experts to ask the right questions, working with designers to communicate the data that really allow many more groups to understand and expose underlying conditions. I ask you all to change power dynamics. Building data helps change the power dynamics inherent in controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits, such as teaching data literacy. So I think, in the case of when we're collecting air quality, we can really have an impact by showing the government some real problems. But also, when we're doing those kind of data collection, we're teaching ourselves about data. We're becoming more data literate, like those examples of the people in the Gulf, but many other examples that are in the Build It chapter. I ask you all to expose hidden systems. Coming up with unique ways to quantify and model data can expose messages previously hidden from the public eye. However, we must expose ideas ethically, going back to the first principle above. And so here, if you think about what we did with the $1 Million Blocks project by showing how much money we spend to incarcerate people, or this project where we expose how much vacancy exists in current Chinese cities, really use models to help explain and expose systems that can affect those on the margins. The next one is ground truth. We must validate the work we do with data by literally observing the phenomena on the ground and asking those it affects to interpret the results. And we can see by ground truthing in the Ghost Cities project, I was actually able to get a lot more information about the phenomenon. And also it allowed me to connect with people to really help them think about ways that they might change and improve amenities in those areas to actually make them not ghost cities. Share data. Data sharing is essential for communicating the need for policy change and generating debate, essential for that work. And I would argue it's not necessarily just open data that we need to share, but we really need to share data through visualizations, because not everyone can be data scientists. In order to give more open access, communication through data visualizations is really important. Create your own ethical standards and remember that data are people. We must do them no harm, and we must seek to develop our own standards of practice and call upon others to do the same. And here what I really mean is technology advances way faster than we can create ethical standards. So it's up to us to create our own code of conduct when using new forms of big data that are coming into us every day. So think about autonomous vehicles and what are the standards that are being created right now around that. And remember that behind all data is really every one of us. So this is a summary of data action. It sets out to remind us that big data in its raw form cannot perform on its own. It's rather how data is transformed and operationalized that can change the way that we see the world. More specifically, data can be used for civic action and policy change by communicating with the data clearly and responsibly to expose hidden patterns and ideologies to audiences inside and outside the policy arena. And I hope the examples I provided today inspire you to create your own data action. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very, very much. Actually, those examples were mind-blowing. I know about the book, I've read the book, but it's so cool to hear you talk about it. And they're great. And I don't know if you'd be willing to take some questions from the people who are logged in.
Absolutely.
3 or 4 questions. Oh, awesome. So, si alguien quiere preguntar, aprovechen. They're shy.
Vamos, muchachos, aunque sea en español, tenemos traductor.
¿Qué es qué? Sí. ¿Me van a hacer quedar mal? Ahí está. ¿Aló?
Hi. Sorry. That was my phone. Hi, Sarah. I think your talk was very, very insightful and just very inspiring. And I was wondering, what's your opinion about the gap between academia and the need to focus on public good and activism, especially when academia in general is overwhelmingly crowded by people more worried about apparent neutrality and a very narrow understanding of what rigorosity should look like instead of what's best for our communities. Like, how do we bridge this gap? And in our particular context, is it possible, and how so?
So bridge the gap between academia and communities. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. And with, you know, all kinds of academic projects to really embed community, I mean, in them, either through like the example that I showed by just asking them whether our data is valid or not, right? Because I think actually that kind of ground truthing improves the research quite significantly. And I found in all the projects that I've worked on, really by asking people in the data whether my analysis rings true, they make my research project better by helping me edit it, but also make it more ethical. So I do think there's a tendency in academia not to involve communities, not so much in urban planning programs, but maybe in data science programs. And I think that has to do a bit with the fact that data scientists are simply not trained to work with communities. That's not part of, you know, their education process. So I think one thing that I try to do here at MIT is, you know, tell data scientists that are working on community data really that they, you know, should reach out and seek community work. And that's, we have a new urban planning program, or sorry, computer science program called Urban Science, which is meant to be a computer science and urban planning mashed up. And that's one of the values we try to teach those data sciences in that class, but we need to do that more and more.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question.
¿Alguien más? Que no les dé pena.
They're tired. It's the end of the day.
Yeah, it's either that or they're just very, very shy. I don't know.
And
I don't know what it
where
is.
is everybody coming from today? Is this your class or undergrad, the grad students?
No, most of them are from a graduate course, a master's program.
Masters,
Yeah. That's an interdisciplinary program between computer sciences, design, and communication sciences.
Okay.
Some of them are from college level classes. I see 2 of them, but they're not so shy normally. They usually are very, very chatty. So I don't know maybe they're sleepy as you've mentioned.
Maybe. Or maybe
but yeah,
my English was too fast. I don't know.
Nah, they can catch up to that. But yeah, that was the reason why I asked you to do this talk, because interdisciplinary work, I think it's very, very important, especially with how computer sciences and technological advances, as you've said. They're way, way, way too fast, and sometimes we as technologists do not think about the consequences or what we are really, really doing. And so that's how I got to your book, and so that's why I asked you, because I think that technology and data are indeed actionable tools, and they can be very, very powerful tools. But it's one thing that enterprises have them, or governments, and it's very, very different from the people to have that power too. And that's something I talk about a lot in my classes when they ask things, but they don't want to ask things.
Maybe I should ask them things. How many of you are data scientists? You can raise your hands.
That's a good question, actually. Come on, people.
Vamos, muchachos.
I don't think there's a data scientist over here. Actually,
no, urban planners, any?
Design students mostly.
Mostly design. Architecture.
Yeah.
How many architects?
I don't think there's any architects.
No architects. Graphic design then. What
graphic
kind of
designers? Yeah.
Graphic designers. Okay.
Yeah, it's weird because they're not specifically graphic designers. They are like integral designers. Most of them come from a graphic background, but there are some information designers and industrial designers too.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple of technologists over there, but I don't see them anymore. But I did see them a little while ago. Pero bueno, entonces, última llamada. ¿Nadie quiere preguntar nada? Well, it's their loss. Apparently, they are really, really tired. Or just shy, I don't know.
Thanks to Aldo for asking a question.
Yeah, at least she did. So,
muy bien,
awesome.
Muy bien. Sara, muchas gracias. Y bueno, pues a todos ustedes les agradezco su presencia. Le estaremos ya haciendo llegar su constancia de participación a Sara y sobre todo pues agradecerle esta experiencia. Me parece muy interesante que observemos justamente la forma en cómo ella resuelve la cuestión de la interdisciplina, ¿no? Como finalmente no solamente es la conjugación de conocimientos que vienen de diferentes áreas, sino que logran logran realmente concretarlo en un trabajo, pues en varios trabajos que nos ha presentado acá. Muchas gracias, Sara. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you, guys. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you very, very, very much.
Gracias.
Adiós.
Nice to meet you, Gilberto, as well.
Nice to meet you too, and
Gracias. Igual.
thank you. It was amazing.
Hopefully, I'll see you in Mexico sometime.
Yeah, let's make it so.
Okay, bye.